My mother, Victoria, adjusted the lapel of my uniform with a look of pure pity. Her voice was calm, the way one speaks about an old item that needs to be discarded. "Pamela, your sister's future is in that grand ballroom." She kept her eyes fixed on the wealthy guests behind the glass. "You are just a common soldier, and this coarse look of yours will ruin the evening. Take the back entrance by the trash bins. That is the appropriate place for you right now." I stood still on the cold marble floor, my fingers gripping my folder until my knuckles turned white. I did not answer. I only felt the heavy thud of my pulse as I watched her turn away, greeting the Harrington family with the kind of smile she never gave me. She believed she was pushing me into the shadows to protect her vanity. She did not know that Marcus, the head manager of the Sterling Hotel, was standing in the office right behind that service door, holding a pen and waiting for my arrival. Beside him, standing in the shadows of the office, was Colonel Miller. He was a man of steel and silence, my grandfather's legal executor and the only person who knew that tonight was not a celebration of Natalie's future, but the beginning of my mother's past. Hello to the mothers and grandmothers listening. Have you ever realized the people you give everything to are often the ones who would shame you the most? Come back with me to 12 years ago, when a soldier's first paychecks were sent home to a family that was never satisfied. I stood motionless among the heavy scent of refuse rising from the gray plastic bins lined up behind the Sterling Hotel. The night air was a sharp, biting cold that cut through the fabric of my Class A uniform, a persistent reminder of the place my mother had carved out for me. My spine ached. The old injury from my second deployment throbbed in rhythm with the distant bass of the music playing inside the ballroom. As my fingers brushed against the rough, damp stone of the exterior wall, the texture triggered a sudden, electric jolt through my nervous system. I closed my eyes and let the present dissolve, the stench of the alleyway fading into the scent of old parchment and beeswax. I allowed myself to fall back 15 years, back to the day when this building was still a sanctuary of belonging, long before it became a stage for my exclusion. The office on the mezzanine was always flooded with a specific kind of afternoon light, a deep honey gold that seemed to pull the dust motes into a slow, rhythmic dance. My grandfather sat behind the heavy mahogany desk, his large hands marked with the dark spots of age as they rested near a stack of leather-bound ledgers. I remember the weight of his palm when he placed it on my shoulder. It was a heavy, grounding pressure that did not push me down, but rather anchored me to the floor, making me feel as though I were part of the foundation of the hotel itself. He peered through his spectacles, the glass reflecting the flickering sunlight, his breathing steady and warm. The air in that room was thick with the slow, methodical ticking of the grandfather clock, a sound that promised that time was something to be managed with care and precision. I reached out to touch the silver tie clip he had left on the desk, a small piece of metal engraved with stalks of grain. It was cold against my skin at first, then it began to warm in my palm, absorbing my own heat. He did not speak, but he used his thumb to graze the back of my hand, a silent gesture of recognition that I was the one he trusted with the legacy of his hard work. In the black and white photographs on the wall, I saw myself standing straight and proud beside him, a central figure in a world built on the quiet strength of things that lasted. The sound of silk against marble cut through the golden thread of that memory like a serrated blade. Victoria entered the suite, her high-end gown creating a sharp, rhythmic rustle that signaled the end of my internal peace. She moved with a controlled grace, her back narrow and rigid as she stepped toward the vanity where the jewelry boxes were laid out. I reached out, my fingers hovering just an inch from the red velvet box containing the family diamond, but before I could make contact, she snatched it away. Her movement was so sudden it felt like a physical strike. "Natalie, come take this ring," she said, her voice dropping into a register of soft, performative tenderness. "Do not let your sister touch it. Those coarse hands of hers will only scratch something this delicate." She turned her body, creating a physical barrier with her shoulder, a wall of silk and bone that effectively erased me from the conversation. I stood there, less than 3 feet away, watching as she lifted Natalie's hand with a level of care she had never afforded my own. Victoria's fingers trembled slightly as she slid the diamond onto my sister's finger, her eyes shining with a genuine, raw emotion that made the exclusion feel even more deliberate. She was capable of love, I realized. She simply chose to ration it. She took a damp paper towel and meticulously wiped the surface of the ring, a public act of cleansing the imaginary stain my proximity might have caused. Natalie looked at her reflection in the mirror, a triumphant smile spreading across her face as she admired the sparkle against her skin, completely ignoring my presence as if I were a piece of furniture that had been moved out of the way. I felt the breath leave my lungs, my chest tightening as if a steel band were being cinched around my ribs, making each inhalation a shallow, painful effort. I focused my gaze on a small crack in the plaster of the far wall, refusing to let them see the flicker of a reaction. I forced myself to stand straighter, my arms pinned to my sides in the rigid posture of an officer on parade. It was a survival reflex I had spent a lifetime perfecting, a way to keep the tremors in my fingers from reaching the surface. I could feel the pulse thumping in my throat, a heavy, rhythmic pressure that I fought to swallow down. My left hand moved instinctively to the small row of ribbons on my chest, the rough texture of the fabric providing a momentary anchor to my own reality, to the rank and the honors I had earned far away from this room. I took a single step back, widening the physical gap between myself and the system that refused to acknowledge my humanity. I was a ghost in this house. A presence that was only felt when there was a bill to be paid or a crisis to be managed. To them, my 12 years of service were nothing more than a decade of becoming unrefined, a transformation into something they found embarrassing to have near their polished surfaces. The realization settled into my bones with a heavy, final clarity. In this room, I was not a daughter, and I was certainly not a major who had managed logistics for thousands of soldiers. I was an intruder in a carefully curated play, a shadow that threatened the perfection of the lighting. This theft of my place in the family was no longer a shock. It had become an invisible law, a rule that had been applied to me for 20 years, until it was woven into the very fabric of our interactions. Victoria continued to whisper to Natalie about the Harrington family, her words filled with the desperate hunger of a woman trying to buy her way into a higher social circle using my sister as currency. They had forgotten that while they were polishing the silver, I was the one who had spent the last 3 years quietly diverting my own paychecks to keep the bank from seizing the very roof over their heads. My mother did not know that the invisibility she forced upon me was the perfect vantage point from which to watch her dismantle my grandfather's life work. The unfairness of the evening was not limited to a stolen ring or a shaming comment. It was calculated and documented in the stack of unpaid invoices I held tightly in my hand. I adjusted the weight of the folder, feeling the sharp edges of the paper through the leather. I looked up at the mezzanine where the old office used to be, knowing that the ghost of the man who had loved me was the only thing still holding this family together. The front doors to the ballroom were about to be thrown open, and the lights would soon find every lie they had told themselves. I walked toward the service entrance, my boots echoing on the pavement, knowing that very soon the cost of making me invisible would be more than they could ever afford to pay. The service door clicked shut behind me, severing the connection to the soft strings of the violin and the polite, hollow laughter of the ballroom guests. I was pushed into the staging area, a space of raw utility where the air smelled of industrial degreaser and the sharp, metallic scent of polished silverware. Racks of crystal wine glasses stood in shimmering, fragile rows, waiting for the hands of servers who would never know my name. While my sister, Natalie, was being coached by my mother on how to glide across the floor under the weight of the chandeliers, I was being pulled back into the relentless gravity of the numbers. My parents had spent decades perfecting the art of the seared family image, a grand facade built on a foundation that was currently rotting. In their world, I was the engine, the unseen mechanism providing the fuel of blood and sweat, while Natalie was the polished exterior, spending the last drops of oil on a performance of grace. I moved to a small, cramped desk tucked into a corner of the industrial kitchen, far from the heat of the ovens but under the rhythmic, annoying flicker of a failing neon light. I placed my heavy folder onto the stainless steel surface, the cold of the metal seeping through the leather and into my palms. I began to flip through the pages, my eyes tracking the bold red ink of the medical invoices. $18,500 for my father's heart surgery, a debt I had cleared 6 months ago by draining the last of my military disability savings. I ran my pencil under the figures, feeling the rough texture of the paper beneath my fingertip. There had been no text message of acknowledgement, no phone call to confirm the receipt of the transfer. Just the silent, hungry expectation that there would always be more. Through the thick glass partition that separated the kitchen from the staging lounge, I could see Natalie. She was perched on a silk-covered armchair, her feet propped up on a velvet ottoman, while a manicurist meticulously filed her nails. My sister lifted a glass of deep red pomegranate juice, took a single, disinterested sip, and then pushed it to the far edge of the mahogany table, leaving a sticky ring on the polished wood. She didn't touch a single piece of paper. Her eyes were locked onto the glowing screen of a new smartphone, her thumb scrolling through images of designer wedding gowns that cost more than 6 months of my salary as an Army major. She existed in a world where things simply appeared, provided by a magic she never bothered to question, while I sat in the flickering light, documenting the cost of her ignorance. The rustle of silk announced Victoria's arrival before I heard her footsteps. She walked toward my small desk, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. She didn't look at my face. Instead, she used 2 fingers to pinch the corner of the medical invoice, lifting it as if it were a piece of soiled laundry that had accidentally crossed her path. She flicked it aside, letting it flutter toward the edge of the desk, and replaced it with a stack of glossy photographs of a pearl necklace. "Natalie needs this set to match the Harrington family's standards," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of any weight. "Pamela, don't sit there making a long face over those numbers. You are a soldier. You have your allowances and your pension to draw from. Your sister only has her beauty as her capital, and we must invest in it while we can." She began to adjust the lighting on a nearby tablet, making sure the luster of the pearls was highlighted, completely ignoring the faded scars on my wrists or the way my shoulders were locked in a permanent state of tension. My father, Harold, stepped into the light behind her. He didn't acknowledge me either, his hand immediately finding Natalie's shoulder in a gesture of paternal pride as she showed him a photo on her phone. He pulled out his own phone, speaking loudly into the receiver to someone on the other end, boasting about how the Seared family was more than capable of handling the excessive costs of a sterling wedding. His voice was full of a jovial, wealthy confidence, the sound of a man who had never looked at a bank statement in his life. While he spoke, his other hand moved behind his back, making a sharp, urgent motion for me to sign the check that was clipped to the top of my folder. He used his body as a physical shield, positioning himself so that Natalie wouldn't have to see the reality of the transaction, creating a hard, invisible boundary where I was the debt collector and she was the princess. I picked up my pen and pressed the tip onto the check. I pushed down with such force that the metal ballpoint left a deep, permanent indentation on the stainless steel surface beneath the paper. It was my only release, a silent scream of frustration held behind a face that remained as still as a mask. I ground my teeth together, the muscles in my jaw flaring as I watched my mother excitedly flip through the pages of a high-end bridal magazine. I could feel the tight coil of my military bun at the base of my skull, a constant physical reminder of the discipline that kept me from standing up and throwing the entire folder of debt into their faces. To them, I wasn't a person with a future or a life of my own. I was a living trust fund, a resource to be managed and exhausted for the sake of an image they couldn't afford. I stood up slowly, the movement methodical and precise. I gathered the medical bills, tucking them back into my bag with the same care I used when checking my sidearm before a mission. My legs felt heavy, the support from my specialized military boots being the only thing keeping the pain in my spine from becoming a distraction. I didn't look at Natalie, and I didn't look at my parents. I turned my gaze toward the dark corridor that led to the management offices, a part of the hotel they had never bothered to visit. They were so focused on the pearls, the fine silks, and the Harringtons that they had forgotten who actually signed the contracts that kept the lights on in this building. The absurdity of it all had reached its peak. They were using my blood to build a sandcastle for Natalie, and then demanding that I crawl through the service entrance so I wouldn't ruin the view. I no longer felt the sharp sting of being the abandoned child. That had been replaced by a cold, clinical contempt for the people who were parasitic on my sacrifice, while believing they were the ones granting me a favor. Victoria was still talking about the Harringtons' social standing, her voice a constant drone of ambition, but she had forgotten one very important detail. Every major financial transaction at the Sterling, every audit, and every line of credit now flowed through a system I had spent the last 3 months quietly rebuilding. The insults in the ballroom were just the final drops in an already overflowing cup, pushing me toward a decision I would make in the silence of the next hour. My father's claims of being well off were about to be tested against the freezing light of the actual bank balances, and for the first time in my life, I was the one who held the ledger. The pressure from the upcoming engagement party and the relentless, predatory calls from the bank debt collectors had turned the air inside the Sierra house into something thick and suffocating, like breathing through wet wool. My father, Harold, had waited until the rain started to pour before insisting that I accompany him on a drive to talk about the future. It was a calculated move, a forced confinement in the cramped interior of his old SUV, where the smell of damp leather and stale coffee created a cage I couldn't escape. The rhythmic, heavy thud of the rain against the roof was the only soundtrack to his silence as we pulled away from the curb. He drove slowly, his eyes fixed on the dark road ahead, while I sat in the passenger seat, feeling the cold from the window pane beginning to seep through my uniform and settle into the old ache in my lower back. This was not a conversation. It was an emotional siege designed to turn my years of service into a debt that could never be fully repaid. Harold gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white under the thin, age-spotted skin of his fingers. He didn't turn to look at me, not even once. His lips were pressed into a thin, bloodless line that twitched occasionally, a sign that he was mentally rehearsing the next set of financial demands he was about to place on my shoulders for Natalie's wedding. I pressed my body against the door, trying to minimize the space I occupied, my own hands knotted together in my lap to keep from reaching for the door handle. The streetlights strobed over his face like passing ghosts, illuminating a man I realized I no longer knew. He reached out and turned off the radio with a sharp, final click, ensuring that his voice would be the only thing I could hear. A technique he used whenever he wanted to colonize my thoughts with his own version of reality. "Pamela, you have to understand the position your mother and I are in," he began, his voice dropping into a low, threatening rumble that vibrated in the small space. "We sacrificed everything, every single thing we had, to make sure you could reach that rank of major. We worked the extra shifts. We skipped the vacations. We wore the old clothes just so you could have the life you have now." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't want one. "Now it is time for you to show some gratitude. Natalie isn't built like you. She doesn't have your strength or your benefits. She needs this wedding to be perfect so she can stand on equal footing with the Harringtons. And that means you need to step aside and do what is necessary for this family." He suddenly slammed his palm against the steering wheel, a sharp cracking sound that made my entire body flinch, a reflexive startle from the desert that I had spent years trying to suppress. He turned his head for a split second, his eyes reflecting a cold, clinical pressure, as if my sister's lack of resilience was a failure I was personally responsible for fixing. He pointed a shaking index finger at my face, a gesture of absolute authority he used to end any debate before I could even formulate a word. A bitter, jagged smile touched his lips as the heater in the car blew hot, dry air that smelled of dust, making the windows fog up and trapping us in a world that only consisted of his demands. Harold reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper covered in his messy handwriting. He placed it on my lap like a military order, a list of numbers that represented the next pound of flesh he expected me to provide. $12,000 for the florist, $8,000 for the vintage car rental. He didn't ask about the nerve pain that was currently shooting down my leg from the damp cold. He didn't ask how I was managing the mortgage on their house. He simply began to recite the things Natalie deserved, using a soft, artificial tone of warmth to sugarcoat the absolute financial theft he was proposing in the name of family loyalty. I closed my eyes and took a long, shallow breath, trying to dull the sharp stabs of pain radiating from my spine. I squeezed my hands together until I could feel my fingernails biting into my palms, creating deep, stinging crescent moons in the skin to keep myself from exploding in that small, airless space. I watched the raindrops trail down the glass, turned a sickly, jaundiced yellow by the passing streetlights, much like the way my father was twisting the truth of my 12 years in the army. To him, my deployments and my injuries were not achievements. They were assets to be liquidated for my sister's benefit. I decided then that I would not give him the satisfaction of a fight. My lips remained pressed together, losing all their color as I stared out at the horizon, where the silhouette of the Sterling Hotel was beginning to emerge through the gray curtain of rain. My breathing became rhythmic and terrifyingly steady, a sign that I had officially disconnected from the man sitting next to me, moving into the cold, observant state of a soldier behind a scope. The realization settled over me that love in the Ciard family was never a gift. It was a high-interest loan, a slave contract signed with the ink of guilt and empty promises. My father didn't see a daughter sitting in the seat next to him. He saw a logistical solution, a tool to maintain a dream of grandeur for the child he actually loved. My silence was not a sign of submission, but the quiet that precedes a massive shift in the landscape. A pause before the truth I had discovered in Marcus's office would sweep away every lie he was currently building in this SUV. He continued to speak about the Harringtons and the importance of legacy, his voice a droning, hollow sound against the backdrop of the storm, oblivious to the fact that I was no longer listening to the words, only recording the depth of his betrayal for the final reckoning. When the SUV finally screeched to a halt at the service entrance of the ballroom, Harold sat back with a sigh of satisfaction, believing he had successfully crushed my spirit under the weight of his perceived sacrifices. He didn't know that every time he counted his supposed contributions, I was silently subtracting the final remnants of my compassion for this family. He climbed out into the rain, leaving me alone for a moment in the dark, damp interior of the car. I looked down at the note on my lap, the ink blurring as a single drop of water from my jacket fell onto the paper, and I felt a strange, cold peace wash over me. I was at the very bottom of my loneliness, abandoned in a back alley among the trash bins by the people I had spent my life protecting, but I was also the only one who knew that the floor was about to drop out from under them. My father's SUV came to a halt behind the loading dock of the Sterling Hotel, the tires splashing through deep puddles of oily, stagnant water. The rain was relentless, a cold, gray curtain that seemed to soak through the very roof of the vehicle. As I stepped out into the dark, A sharp, white-hot surge of electricity shot through my shoulder blades and down the length of my spine, a violent flare-up of the injury I had carried since my second tour in the desert. The damp air acted as a trigger, turning every vertebra into a jagged edge that scraped against my raw nerves with every breath I took. Harold did not look back. He grabbed his umbrella and hurried toward the warm, golden glow of the main entrance, his mind already occupied by the Harringtons and the hollow prestige of the evening. I was left alone in the alleyway, standing between the towering metal dumpsters and the howling wind that whipped through the narrow gap in the service doors. I stood there at the border of opulence and waste, my body beginning to fail under the weight of a decade of exhaustion and physical pain that had finally reached the absolute limits of human endurance. I stumbled toward the emergency fire escape, my bare hands searching for something, anything, to keep me from collapsing onto the wet asphalt. I found the iron handrail, its surface cold and slick with the downpour, and I gripped it until the peeling paint bit into the skin of my palms. The sound of my breathing was a harsh, scraping noise against the silence of the alley. My knees began to tremble, then they simply buckled, sending me down onto the hard, unforgiving concrete of the landing with a heavy thud. I leaned my entire weight against my arm, feeling the rough, damp texture of the brick wall through the sleeve of my Class A uniform. I closed my eyes tight, trying to stop the rainwater from mixing with the heat behind my eyelids, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts that turned into pale plumes of mist in the freezing air. I reached down to my thigh, squeezing the muscle that was currently locked in a violent cramp, trying to find some sense of strength, but I only found waves of cold fire radiating from my spine. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, my fingers shaking so violently that it took several attempts to find my mother's name in the contacts. I pressed the button, a final fragile hope for some shred of humanity in the middle of this storm. The line rang and rang, the rhythmic tone sounding like a countdown in the darkness of the stairwell. On the other end, I could hear the faint, muffled swell of a string quartet and the bright, artificial laughter of people who had never known a day of physical or emotional hunger. Then, Victoria's voice came through, flat and sharp. "Pamela, do not bother me right now," she said, and I could almost see her checking her reflection in a gilded mirror. "Natalie is about to be introduced to the Harrington family, and I need to be standing right next to her. If you are feeling tired, just sit quietly there by the back door. Do not crawl into the main ballroom looking like that and make me feel ashamed of you." The line went dead with a soft, final click. I stared at the black screen of the phone as my arm slowly dropped to my side. The device slipped from my numb fingers and hit the iron steps with a loud, clattering impact that echoed through the narrow stairwell. I pulled my knees up to my chest, burying my face in the coarse fabric of my uniform, letting the first few drops of moisture fall onto the gray concrete. The sobs were trapped in my throat, held back by a jaw clamped shut until my teeth ached, my hands clawing at the metal steps as if I could squeeze the abandonment out of the very iron. I sat there, curled into a small ball in the corner of the landing, watching my own long, distorted shadows under the flickering motion sensor light. The cold from the concrete soaked through my boots and my clothes, turning me into another piece of the lifeless, mechanical landscape of the hotel's underbelly. I was a ghost in the machine of my own family, a resource that had been used until there was nothing left to give, and then discarded by the trash bins like a broken tool. Then, the shaking stopped. It did not fade. It simply ceased, as if a switch had been flipped deep inside my chest. I used the back of my hand to wipe the dampness from my cheeks, a single, harsh motion that left my skin stinging and dry. I placed my palms on the steps and pushed, forcing my body upward with a slow, agonizing effort that made my vertebrae pop like small, dry twigs. I stood straight, my shoulders square and my chin level, the way I had stood before my battalion during every morning roll call for the last decade. The look in my eyes was no longer one of a daughter seeking shelter. It was the cold, unyielding stillness of a frozen lake, fixed on the steel door that led to the management corridor. I picked up my phone from the steps, wiped the screen on my hem, and tucked it back into my pocket. My fingers were precise now, moving with a clinical efficiency as I adjusted the collar of my uniform and smoothed the wrinkles from the fabric. I ran my thumb over the edge of my ribbons, a quiet ritual to prepare for the coming truth. My breathing was deep and regular, the air no longer a struggle but a tool for the mission ahead. I did not look toward the main ballroom again. I realized in that moment that the only rescue I would ever receive was the cold, hard reality I held in my own hands. My parents had chosen to leave me among the refuse to protect a lie, and that was the moment the final cord between us snapped for good. I was not a daughter begging for a scrap of attention anymore. I was Major Pamela Seard, the woman who held the deed to the very ground they were standing on. I adjusted the weight of the folder under my arm, feeling the sharp edges of the documents that would soon dismantle Victoria's carefully constructed world. I walked toward the administration wing, my boots echoing on the pavement with a sound of finality. The heavy steel door groaned open, and Marcus was there, his expression shifting from professional distance to a deep, solemn respect as he saw my uniform. Beside him, Colonel Miller stood in the shadows, holding a blue navy folder that contained the true intent of my grandfather's will. The secrets of the Seard family were about to be stripped bare, and for the first time, I was the one holding the light. The administrative office of the Sterling Hotel was a sanctuary of cold, cedar-scented air, a pocket of silence that felt entirely separate from the rhythmic thumping of the string quartet and the hollow laughter of the engagement party vibrating through the floorboards above. Marcus pulled out a heavy chair for me, his movements quiet and filled with a sudden deep deference that felt jarring after the dismissal I had experienced in the alleyway. The man I had seen earlier in the shadows, Colonel Miller, now sat directly across from me. His posture was as rigid as a stone monument behind the dark mahogany desk, the same desk he and my grandfather had sat at when they drafted the documents that Victoria thought she had destroyed. Between us sat an old metal box, its surface tarnished by time and embossed with the Seard family crest. The single desk lamp cast a pool of warm amber light over the desk, highlighting the thin layer of dust on the copper lock that had remained undisturbed for years. I reached out, my fingers tracing the oxidized metal. It was biting and cold, a physical shock to my system, and I could feel the microscopic scratches left by my grandfather's hands decades ago when he still held the keys to this world. Colonel Miller pushed the box toward me, his weathered fingers sliding over the metal with a sound that seemed to echo in the quiet room. I lifted the lid, and the scent of aged parchment and dry ink filled the air, a smell that immediately pulled me back to the golden afternoons of my childhood, before the world turned into a series of cold, calculated games. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet that had faded from crimson to a dusty rose, was a single envelope. The words, "For Pamela only," were written in a meticulous, looping script using deep black India ink. I picked up the document, the thick, grainy texture of the paper rasping against my skin as I unfolded it. My eyes locked onto the bold lettering of the original deed to the Sterling Hotel, but it was accompanied by a legal codicil I had never been shown. My name appeared on the line for absolute owner, dated 2 years before my grandfather passed. He had not left this legacy to my father. He had bypassed Harold entirely, leaving it to me under a condition of continued stewardship that my parents had tried to erase. I ran my thumb over the red wax seal at the bottom, feeling the indentation of the signet ring against my flesh, while my breathing slowed into a deliberate military rhythm. It was a final confirmation of my status, a voice from the grave telling me that I was never the intruder my mother claimed I was. Colonel Miller leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk, his gaze holding the weight of a decade of secrets. "Pamela, your grandfather saw the clouds gathering long before the storm hit," he said, his voice a steady, low rasp that seemed to anchor the room. He knew that Harold and Victoria had begun to see the sterling as a mine to be stripped bare rather than a legacy to be protected. He left this to you, not because of the wealth, but because he knew only the discipline of a soldier could keep the soul of this building from those who were willing to sell it for a hollow dream of luxury. He stood up slowly and opened a separate navy blue folder, sliding a stack of audit reports toward me. The pages were a clinical record of betrayal. My father had been busy. There were 3 separate lines of credit taken out under the hotel's name in the last 18 months, totaling nearly $200,000. The funds had been diverted to pay for Natalie's penthouse apartment and the jewelry she was currently wearing upstairs. My father's signature was on every page, but next to it was a clumsy forged version of my own name on the guarantor line, a desperate attempt to tie my military credit to their sinking ship. I gripped the edge of the audit report until the plastic cover began to buckle under the pressure. I looked at the forged signatures, the ink appearing like a series of jagged black wounds on the white paper. I placed the documents back on the desk, the sound of the paper hitting the wood a sharp final crack in the silence. I stood up slowly, the pain in my spine subsiding as the cold clarity of the mission took over. I pulled a formal signing pen from my pocket and placed it next to the will, a silent oath to the man who had truly known me. Then I turned to Marcus and gave him a short, sharp nod of acknowledgement. The preparation was over. I gathered the deed and the audit folder, tucking them into a black leather briefcase with the same methodical care I used when packing my gear for a deployment. Every movement was precise, every breath calculated to maintain the mask of the obedient daughter until the moment of the strike. I moved to the large mirror in the corner of the office to strip away the traces of the alleyway. I smoothed my hair, pulling the military bun tight until it pulled at my scalp, making my face appear as sharp and unforgiving as a flint blade. There was no sign of the exhaustion or the physical flare-up from the storm. I looked at my reflection and saw a stranger, a woman who had mastered the art of the hidden objective. I practiced a small, compliant smile, the exact expression Victoria expected from her daughter. I stepped out of the office and walked through the staff corridor, my boots creating a steady, rhythmic cadence on the hardwood floor that signaled a change in the internal weather. As I approached the service doors to the main ballroom, I stopped a passing waiter and took a silver tray of champagne from his hands. I balanced the weight of the crystal glasses, feeling the cold condensation against my palms, and adjusted my posture. I let my shoulders drop slightly and softened my gaze, becoming the invisible girl once again. I pushed through the double doors and was immediately hit by the smell of expensive lilies and floor wax, an overwhelming contrast to the cedar-scented quiet of the office. Victoria and Harold were seated at the head table, their faces flushed with the perceived success of their performance. They looked up as I approached, their eyes narrowing with a satisfaction that made my skin crawl. They believed I had finally been broken by the walk through the trash, that I had accepted the role of the silent provider. Natalie was laughing, her diamond ring catching the light of the chandeliers in a shimmering insult to the life I had built. I moved toward them with the tray, my movements fluid and submissive, concealing the black briefcase and the list of forged debts beneath the veneer of a soldier who had learned to stay in line. The truth about the sterling was never just about the property. It was a testament of honor that my grandfather had entrusted to the only person in the seared line who understood the true cost of sacrifice. My parents were busy courting the Harrington family with a power they did not possess, unaware that the very ground beneath their feet had already shifted. I stepped up to the table and began to place the champagne glasses in front of them, my hands steady and precise. I watched Victoria lean back in her chair, her eyes shining with the arrogance of a woman who thought the game was already won. She didn't know that the $50,000 invoice for the seafood tower was currently sitting in Marcus's hand, and it required a signature that no longer belonged to my father. The engagement party had reached its crescendo, a shimmering spectacle of hollow prosperity staged under the golden glow of 1,000 crystal prisms. Natalie and Bradley Harrington stood near the podium, the air around them thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the heavy floral perfume of the city's elite guests. My family sat at the center table, an island of white silk and polished silver that looked, from a distance, like the very definition of a legacy preserved. Victoria caught my eye and gestured for me to come closer, her hand moving with a practiced, elegant grace that hid the cold calculation behind her gaze. She knew this was the perfect moment, the precise intersection of public expectation and private exhaustion where she believed my resistance would finally crumble. She looked at me not as a daughter who had just walked through the rain, but as the final obstacle to the narrative she had spent 30 years writing, and she was ready to use every tool in her inventory to ensure I signed away the only thing that actually belonged to me. Victoria reached out and touched my arm, her fingers soft and warm, a rare physical affection that felt jarringly out of place in a decade of cold distance. She pulled a chair out for me, her movements deliberate and maternal, and ushered me to sit in the empty space between her and Natalie. "Eat something, Pamela," she whispered, her voice a low, soothing hum as she used a silver fork to place a piece of gold-seared foie gras onto my plate. "You look so tired, and we have so much to celebrate tonight now that the family is finally coming together." I sat in silence, watching her long, red manicured nails graze the white silk of the tablecloth. She began to speak of a future where we were no longer at odds, her words like a warm solvent designed to dissolve the hard edges of my caution. She leaned in closer, the scent of her champagne and expensive perfume clouding the air between us, and she slipped her hand over mine, squeezing it with a tenderness that was entirely performative. She offered me a spoonful of mushroom bisque, blowing on it gently as if I were still the 12-year-old girl she used to ignore, all while keeping her eyes fixed on Eleanor Harrington, who was watching us from across the table. It was a masterpiece of staging, a physical display of care intended to make me feel ungrateful for even thinking of a refusal. The transition happened so smoothly I almost missed the shift in the air. My father, Harold, cleared his throat and adjusted his silk tie, his face losing the jovial mask he had been wearing for the guests. He reached into the leather briefcase at his feet and slid a heavy green folder across the silk tablecloth. The sound of the paper rasping against the fabric was a dry, clinical noise that cut through the sound of the string quartet. He placed a gold fountain pen on top of the folder, the nib pointing directly at my chest like an invitation that carried the weight of a command. "Pamela, this is the formal transfer of the sterling stewardship to Natalie and Bradley as their primary wedding gift," he said, his voice dropping into the cold, professional tone of a business broker. "You have your own life in the military, your own rank, and your own benefits that we sacrifice to give you. You don't need the burden of managing a historic property like this. Sign the documents now, while the witnesses are here, and help your sister establish herself with the Harringtons. Don't let us be known as the kind of family that hoards its resources when one of us is in need." I looked down at the documents, the bold legal clauses staring back at me, a calculated effort to strip away my grandfather's true intent under the guise of a generous family gift. Natalie stopped her staged laughter and set her crystal glass down, her eyes narrowing as she watched the pen. She didn't speak, but her lips were pressed into a thin, expectant line, her entire posture leaning toward the folder as if she could pull the signature out of me by sheer will. Bradley Harrington shifted in his seat, his gaze moving between me and my father, beginning to notice the sudden, heavy silence that had fallen over our table. Harold hasted, his breathing quickened as he leaned forward, trying to occupy more of my physical space, his presence becoming a wall of pressure that demanded immediate compliance. He tapped his finger on the signature line, a rhythmic, impatient sound that signaled the end of his patience. He didn't ask how my back felt after the drive, or if I was still in pain from the cold. He only looked at the clock, measuring the minutes until the official toast would make the lie permanent. When I didn't move, the warmth in Victoria's face vanished as if it had never been there. She withdrew her hand from mine, and her eyes turned into sharp, glittering slits of silver. She leaned in so close I could feel the heat of her breath against my ear, her voice dropping to a jagged whisper that was intended only for me. "If you think you can humiliate us tonight, Pamela, you are mistaken," she hissed, the softness of her earlier tone replaced by a direct threat. "I know about the psychological evaluations you had after your last tour. I know how fragile your status is with the medical board. If you don't sign that folder right now and play your part, I will make sure the Army hears about your mental instability and your inability to handle the stress of your rank. I will take everything you have left." Under the table, she found the top of my foot with the sharp point of her stiletto heel and pressed down with a slow, agonizing force, a physical cruelty that was hidden by the elegant drape of the tablecloth. Natalie looked at me with an expression that had lost all its innocence, her sharp nails tapping a frantic, demanding rhythm against the wood of the chair. My father crossed his arms over his chest and looked at me with a profound, cold contempt, making it clear that if I chose to walk away from this table without signing, I would be walking away from the seared name forever. I felt the siege from all sides, the words, the physical pain, and the overwhelming weight of their collective greed closing in on me like a snare. They had spent decades turning my loyalty into a cage, and now they were moving in for the final kill, believing that the setting of this ballroom would be the perfect place to bury my autonomy. I looked at the gold pen, feeling the absolute falsehood of every claim they had ever made about family and love. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted a ghost who would sign checks and stay out of the light. The realization that they were willing to destroy my career and my health to protect a lie was the final clarification I needed. I reached out my right hand, my fingers moving with a slow, deliberate precision as they closed around the cold metal of the fountain pen. I could hear Victoria catch her breath, a small sound of triumph that she couldn't quite suppress, while Harold leaned back slightly, his chest swelling with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally broken a stubborn horse. Natalie's smile began to return, a predatory, expectant look that mirrored our mother's arrogance. I lifted the pen, the black ink hovering just millimeters above the line for the owner's consent, and I saw Marcus approaching from the corner of my eye. He was carrying a silver tray, but it didn't hold champagne this time. On it sat a navy blue folder from the supply office, containing the $50,000 seafood invoice that had been flagged for an unauthorized signature. I didn't look at my mother's face, and I didn't feel the pressure of her heel anymore. I only felt the weight of the truth I was about to deploy, and the silence of the ballroom seemed to stretch into an infinite frozen moment as the manager came to a halt beside my father's chair. The music from the string quartet stopped abruptly, leaving a void in the air that was filled only by the frantic, shallow breathing of my sister Natalie. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes bright with a predatory triumph, as she watched my hand hover over the signature line of the transfer document. The silence in the ballroom became heavy and airless, the kind of silence that precedes a controlled demolition. I held the gold fountain pen for a moment longer, feeling the cold weight of the metal against my skin, and then I slowly, deliberately, set it aside. I did not drop it. I placed it exactly parallel to the edge of the mahogany table, a gesture of finality that made Victoria's smile flicker for the first time. Marcus, the hotel manager, stepped forward and positioned himself directly behind my chair, his presence acting as a physical barrier between me and the suffocating pressure of my parents. This was the moment where the 12 years of lies, the stolen paychecks, and the calculated dismissals were forced to confront a reality they could no longer hide. The center of the ballroom, under the blinding brilliance of the crystal chandeliers, felt like a stage where the actors had forgotten their lines. I reached into the interior pocket of my dress uniform and withdrew a thick envelope embossed with the red wax seal of the federal attorney's office. I placed it directly on top of my father's green folder, the rasp of the paper against the silk tablecloth sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. My fingers moved with the steady, practiced precision of a soldier clearing a jam, smoothing the document until the bold black lettering was visible to everyone at the table. It was the deed of absolute ownership for the Sterling Hotel, registered in the name of Major Pamela Ciard. I pushed the paper toward the center of the table, my eyes fixed on my mother's face, refusing to blink. My shoulders remained square, my posture unyielding, as I fulfilled the final requirement of the mission my grandfather had entrusted to me. Marcus bowed slightly, his face a mask of professional solemnity, and took a heavy brass nameplate from a silver tray. He placed it next to my documents with a soft metallic clink. The word owner was engraved in deep black letters that seemed to absorb the light of the candles. I watched my own fingertips resting on the table, noting with a strange detached clarity that they were perfectly still. There was no tremor, no hesitation, only the rhythmic, deep breathing of a person who had finally reached the objective. The light from the chandeliers reflected off the smooth surface of the certificate, casting a cold, clinical glow over the space between me and the people who had tried to erase me. The guests at the surrounding tables began to notice the shift in energy, the ice in the wine buckets melting unnoticed as the silence stretched into an unbearable tension. "This is the $50,000 invoice for the seafood tower and the premium bar service that Marcus needs signed," I said, my voice flat and devoid of any emotional inflection. "And this is the deed to the Sterling. I used the entirety of my military disability settlement and the savings from 3 tours of duty to buy this property back from the bank when I discovered you had secretly mortgaged it to the breaking point. You spent my blood to buy Natalie's penthouse and her jewelry, believing I would never look at the ledger." Victoria's face transformed in an instant. The mask of the elegant socialite shattered, leaving behind a raw, jagged desperation that made the veins in her neck stand out like cords. She stood up so violently that her silk-covered chair tipped backward, hitting the marble floor with a jarring, metallic sound that echoed through the entire hall. She slammed both of her hands onto the table, making the crystal glasses jump and sending a spray of deep red wine across the white tablecloth, where it began to bloom like a series of ugly, dark stains. "You lying, ungrateful girl!" she shrieked, her voice cracking as she abandoned every shred of her carefully curated poise. "You are nothing but a common soldier, a person who belongs in the mud of a back alley. How dare you think you can take what belongs to this family? How dare you steal Natalie's future?" My father, Harold, did not move. He sat slumped in his chair, his face turning a sickly, ashen gray as he stared at the federal seal on the documents. His hands were clamped onto the edge of the table, his knuckles white and skeletal, as he realized that the forgery and the financial manipulation he had relied on were now public record. He tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. Around us, the Harrington family and their guests began to pull back, their expressions shifting from confusion to a cold, visceral disgust as the true nature of the Ciard family was laid bare under the ballroom lights. Natalie covered her face with her hands, her diamond-encrusted fingers digging into her cheeks as she realized the sparkle of her ring was being extinguished by the truth. I stood up slowly, the movement methodical and calm. I did not respond to my mother's insults. I did not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply picked up the gold fountain pen, tucked it back into my pocket, and smoothed the front of my uniform. I turned to Marcus and gave him a single sharp nod, authorizing him to continue the hotel's operations according to the new legal protocols. I felt a profound sense of liberation, a physical weight lifting from my chest as the invisible chains of guilt and debt that had bound me for 20 years finally snapped. My boots made a steady, ringing sound on the marble as I began to walk away from the table, moving with the quiet dignity of a woman who had reclaimed her own name. I did not look back at the wreckage of the dinner party or the screaming woman who was currently being watched with horror by the very elite she had tried so hard to impress. Bradley Harrington remained frozen at the podium, his eyes following me with a look of profound realization. He looked back at Natalie, his hands dropping to his sides, as if he had just discovered he was standing in the middle of a collapsing ruin. I walked past Colonel Miller, who stood near the exit with a faint, satisfied smile on his face. He reached out and touched the sleeve of my uniform, a final gesture of recognition and respect that meant more to me than any of the hollow accolades of the evening. I pushed open the grand doors of the ballroom and stepped out into the night. The air was cold and clean, smelling of rain and asphalt, and I drew it deep into my lungs. The heat of the metals on my chest felt like a steady, grounding force, a reminder of a reality that was built on something far more substantial than silk and champagne. The sounds of my mother's shouting faded as the heavy doors closed behind me, replaced by the quiet hum of the city and the distant rhythm of traffic. I walked toward my car, my fingers closing around the steering wheel as a strange, cold peace settled over my spirit. I knew that the next few weeks would be a period of natural consequences, a time for the legal and financial gravity to finish the work I had started tonight. I sat there in the darkness for a moment, watching the streetlights reflect off the hood of the car, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for an order or a demand. The system of lies had finally collapsed under its own weight, and as I pulled away from the curb, I saw a familiar figure standing under the amber glow of a street lamp, waiting for a conversation that would change everything. The waves from that night at the Sterling have finally begun to recede, leaving behind a stark and freezing reality for my parents. 3 weeks have passed, and the local newspapers and the city's social circles no longer speak of the Ciard family as a symbol of old-world prestige. Instead, our name has become a clinical case study in vanity and the inevitable failure of a system built on hollow promises. I moved into a small, minimalist apartment on the edge of the city, a space that smells of fresh paint and nothing else. From my new window, I watch the world move on, observing the collapse of my parents' social standing not with a sense of triumph, but with the quiet, detached clarity of a soldier who has finally completed an exhausting tour of duty. The debt of loyalty I thought I owed them has been paid in full, and the receipt is written in the silence of this room. I sat on my new sofa this afternoon, the fabric still stiff and smelling of the showroom, with a single bank notice held in my hand. The afternoon sun was pale and thin, casting long, dusty shadows across the cardboard boxes containing my Class A gear and the few personal belongings I kept. The letter was a formal notification regarding the freezing of Harold's personal assets, a direct consequence of the unauthorized credit lines and forged signatures that had finally been flagged by the federal audit. I ran my fingers over the numbers, the massive debts he had accumulated appearing now as nothing more than ink on a page, no longer a weight I was required to carry on my own shoulders. I placed the paper on the small wooden coffee table, my movements slow and deliberate, and watched a single yellow leaf flutter past the window in the autumn wind. There was a profound, physical lightness in the act of setting it down, a realization that the financial gravity which had anchored me to their demands was finally pulling them down instead. Across the city, the reports from Marcus tell a different story. Victoria is currently spending her afternoons at high-end consignment shops, attempting to sell off her silk gowns and the jewelry I once paid for just to cover the basic utility bills I used to handle without a word. I received a message that she was denied entry to her usual bridge club, the very place where she used to use her perceived status to diminish my accomplishments in front of her friends. I sat back and interlaced my fingers, feeling the strange, new sensation of freedom in my own hands. I no longer had to wake up wondering which invoice would be the one to break me, or how many hours of overtime I would need to work to fund a lifestyle that was never meant for me. The machine of their vanity had run out of fuel, and I was no longer willing to provide the blood to keep it running. A soft, hesitant knock at my door broke the afternoon silence. I stood up, the old ache in my spine a dull hum rather than a sharp bite, and opened the door to find Bradley Harrington. He was not wearing the tailored tuxedo from the engagement party. Instead, he wore a simple dark jacket and looked as though he hadn't slept in several days. His eyes were heavy with a sincere, weary regret. "Pamela, I'm not here to ask for anything or to make any excuses," he said, his voice low and steady. "I just wanted to tell you how sorry I am for being a part of the theater your parents constructed. I broke off the engagement with Natalie yesterday. It wasn't about the money or the hotel. I realized I couldn't build a life with a family that viewed your sacrifice as nothing more than refuse to be hidden." He reached out and handed me a small wooden box, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against mine. "It's the collection of your grandfather's personal items. Natalie was trying to list them on a private auction site this morning. I thought they should be with the person who actually cares about the man who owned them." He took a respectful step back, his shoulders dropping as if he had just offloaded a massive ethical burden. I took the box from him, feeling the rough, familiar texture of the old oak and the faint, lingering scent of my grandfather's tobacco. Bradley looked at my military boots, and for the first time, I saw a look in his eyes that wasn't judgmental or superior. It was a quiet, profound admiration for the woman who had stood her ground while everyone else was busy playing a part. He gave me a short, solemn nod and turned to walk down the hallway, his footsteps slow and heavy against the carpet. I stood in the doorway for a long time, watching him go, realizing that even someone who had been used as a pawn in my mother's game could recognize the truth once the lights were turned up. The silence that followed his departure wasn't empty. It was a space filled with the weight of a shared understanding that honor cannot be bought or faked. I carried the box to the kitchen and placed it on the counter. I opened the lid and found the silver tie clip, the one with the grain stalks I had touched in the office so many years ago. I picked it up and walked to my bookshelf, placing it in a position of honor next to my service medals. My fingers grazed the cool metal, and I felt a connection to my legacy that had been severed for a decade by my parents' greed. I began to unpack the last of my boxes, organizing my life according to my own rules, each movement meticulous and filled with a new respect for the freedom I had earned. I brewed a pot of tea, the steam rising in the quiet air and softening the memory of that screaming, frantic night at the Sterling. I took a silk cloth and carefully wiped the dust from the frame of my grandfather's photograph, looking into his steady eyes and feeling a silent forgiveness radiating from the image. My jaw was no longer tight, and the tension that had lived in my neck for 3 years had finally dissolved into a deep, physical relaxation. Bradley was not an intruder in my new life. He was a reminder that the truth acts as a filter, removing those who seek to use you and revealing those who are capable of seeing your worth. I realized that the greatest price my parents were paying wasn't the loss of the hotel or the freezing of their bank accounts. It was the fact that they would have to spend the rest of their lives knowing they had discarded the only person who had ever truly tried to protect them. I sat by the window with my tea, watching the sun dip below the horizon, feeling the peace of a woman who no longer has to hide her scars. The doors to my life were still open, but the people who were allowed through them had changed forever. The days ahead promised a quiet I hadn't known since I was a child, a time for the dust to settle and for a new foundation to be laid on the ruins of the old world. I looked at the phone on the table, the screen dark and silent, and I knew that the final conversation of the season was waiting for me just beyond the reach of the city lights. A full year has passed since that final evening at the Sterling Hotel, and my life has settled into a rhythm that feels less like a guarded survival and more like a quiet, steady piece of music. There are no more crescendos of shouting, no more of the sharp, jagged insults that used to punctuate every family dinner like physical blows. I live in a small cottage on the outskirts of the city, a place where the air is clean and the horizon is wide enough to let me breathe without effort. I spend my mornings here, focusing on the slow, methodical recovery of my spine and managing my grandfather's estate with a level of transparency that the Seayard name hasn't seen in decades. Freedom used to feel like a luxury I couldn't afford, a concept reserved for people who didn't carry the weight of a family's vanity on their backs. But now it has become as natural and necessary as the breath in my lungs. The garden behind my house is currently a sea of deep purple lavender, the scent thick and soothing in the early morning heat. I picked up my ceramic watering can, the weight of it familiar and grounding in my hand, and began to move between the rows of flowers. I poured the water slowly, watching the droplets catch the golden light and rest on the vibrant green leaves like small, clear jewels. I reached out and let the soft buds graze my fingertips, feeling the intense, quiet surge of life that comes from something being cared for simply because it exists. I stood up straight, my shoulders back and my chin level, and drew a long, deep breath of the air that smelled of damp earth and herbal sweetness. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel the crushing weight of an invisible hand trying to push me back down into the dirt. I walked over to the wooden table under the large oak tree, where the sunlight was filtered through the leaves into a pattern of dancing shadows. I placed the watering can on the grass and sat down in the linen-covered armchair, watching Colonel Miller as he sat across from me, focused on the morning headlines with a cup of steaming coffee. I reached out and smoothed the edges of the hand-embroidered tablecloth, a gift from a soldier I had served with in my first unit, and felt the rough, honest texture of the thread against my palm. It was a small detail, but it represented a world built on mutual respect and shared history, things that had no price tag in my mother's inventory. I watched a pair of blue jays darting through the branches of the oak tree, their movements quick and free. This was a level of peace I had convinced myself was impossible after 12 years in the desert and 10 years of surviving my parents' emotional siege. But here it was, resting in the palm of my hand like a gift I had finally learned how to accept. The silence was interrupted by the sudden, sharp vibration of my phone on the wooden table. The screen lit up, displaying the word Mom next to a series of missed call notifications that had been accumulating for the last 3 days. I picked up the device and looked at the glowing letters with a stillness in my spirit that felt like a shield. I didn't feel the old, familiar surge of adrenaline or the cold knot of guilt tightening in my stomach. I made a conscious choice not to press the block button. I realized that blocking her would still be a reaction, a frantic effort to keep the noise out, and I no longer needed to hide. I simply let the phone ring, the rhythmic tone fading out on its own until the screen went dark again. I didn't need to hear the words to know what she wanted. Natalie's second attempt at a high society marriage had failed, the Harrington connection was gone, and the bank was finally closing in on the last of their credit lines. I slowly flipped the phone over, face down on the wooden surface, a deliberate and gentle movement that returned the silence to the garden. I was not entering the cycle of demands and artificial crises again. The door to my heart wasn't slammed shut. It remained unlocked for a day when a real apology might arrive. But until then, I was exercising my right to protect the peace I had bled to achieve. My silence wasn't an act of cruelty. It was a discipline, a clear and unwavering boundary set by a woman who had finally outgrown the role of the family's invisible provider. I leaned back into the chair, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face and the steady, quiet pulse in my throat, knowing that I was finally living a life that was entirely my own. The garden gate creaked open, and I stood up to welcome Bradley Harrington as he walked toward the oak tree. He wasn't the man I had first met in the kitchen of the Sterling. The melancholy and the heavy expectations of his family had been replaced by a quiet, sincere lightness in his eyes. He held a bag of specialized herbal tea and a small container of biscuits, and he greeted me with a nod of genuine friendship. We sat together under the shade of the tree, the only sounds being the rustle of the leaves and the soft clink of porcelain as I poured the tea. We spent the next hour discussing the progress of the veteran housing project we were co-sponsoring, a mission that turned my grandfather's resources into a foundation for people who had given everything for their country. Bradley spoke about his own journey toward freedom, about the relief of no longer having to maintain a facade of perfection for a family that didn't know how to see the truth. I listened, occasionally nodding as I recognized the echoes of my own struggle in his words. I offered him a homemade biscuit, and as we sat there in the green, sun-drenched space, I realized that we were two people who had been forged in the same fire of deception and had come out the other side with our honor intact. We didn't need to fill the air with constant conversation. There was a profound comfort in the shared silence, a recognition of the value of being seen and respected for exactly who we were, without the need for silk gowns or diamond rings to justify our presence. To the mothers and grandmothers who have walked this long road with me, Pamela's story is coming to a rest, but the search for peace in our own lives never truly ends. I have learned that a real family isn't defined by the blood in your veins, but by the people who choose to stand by you when the lights go up and all the masks have fallen to the floor. I have learned to love myself enough to build a fence around my heart, not to keep people out, but to ensure that those who are allowed in know how to treat the space with respect. Leaving a situation that is designed to diminish you isn't a betrayal. It is the final, most important rescue mission you will ever undertake. If you have found a spark of strength or a moment of healing in this journey, then hit the subscribe button, give this a like, and share your own path to freedom in the comments. Your story might be the very light that someone else is looking for in their own darkness. Thank you for listening, for standing with me, and for believing that the truth is always worth the cost. May you find the courage to protect your own peace and the freedom to breathe in the sunlight of your own truth. The noon sun reached its peak, casting a brilliant honey-colored light over the lavender and the gray hair of the colonel as he finally folded his newspaper. I watched the birds for a moment longer, feeling the old noise of the Seared family fading into a distant, harmless hum. A new beginning had finally taken root, not in the shadows of the trash bins or the glare of the ballroom, but here in the quiet soil of my own choosing. I reached out and flipped my phone over one last time, seeing a final text message from Marcus about the successful opening of the new community center at the Sterling, and I smiled. The work was done, the ledger was balanced, and as the wind stirred the leaves of the oak tree, I realized that the familiar figure I had seen waiting under the street lamp was just the first of many who were finally ready to see the world as it actually was.